Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires patch 2.3.0 that just came out today from Creative Assembly. And it does have a number of changes, though they did mention from the very beginning that it wasn't going to have the same level of changes as the previous update, but still getting some fixes. The highlights, according to the patch notes: customizable endgame scenarios for multiplayer, new selection videos for the 8 original lords that we got at the launch of Warhammer 1, tweaks to victory objectives of several legendary lords, including Kislev, Tomb Kings, Gogor Kingdoms. Though it may not necessarily be what we need, but we'll see. Changes to how the AI dodges spells, artillery, and other range attacks, along with no difficulty adjustments, a sweep of balance changes to Tomb Kings, Vampire, Accounts Skaven, and more. Okay, so scrolling down here, we do have all of these things that we can see. But I'm gonna skip on ahead directly to stability and performance because, yeah, the multiplayer changes, they basically ended endgame customization to multiplayer. So general updates gameplay wise, they've added a large number of landmarks in Immortal Empires from Mortal Empires and Realms of Chaos, which is a pretty big deal, especially for certain factions, because it's gonna make certain settlements more worth it that should have been worth it, but weren't because they were missing the landmarks. They also added new landmark locations for Monogod factions near their Immortal Empire starting locations. A number of 10-slot settlements that had not yet been ported for Immortal Empires or Realms of Chaos. Now, I haven't played 2.3 yet, but I do hope that includes Carrick 8 Peaks. We'll see. New landmarks for Nurgle in Pigbarter, Old Corn, and Galbaraz / Torre Lear. Savage George Garrison buildings weren't enabling minor settlement battles, various issues. Environment types would sometimes display incorrectly in battles, like various fixes. One big one when we're looking at this list is like attacking an army while in ambush stance will no longer prevent your opponent from bringing in reinforcements. Like, ambush stance was something that people could and were exploiting in campaigns to basically prevent and just give themselves an unfair advantage, which they shouldn't have. Like, ambush stance should not give you that kind of advantage, but it was. In Immortal Empires. Like, you could just switch an ambush stance, you can move and you attack an ambush stance. You shouldn't be able to do that unless it's specific factions or legendary lords that have that benefit or have a special ambush stance like Alif Anar. Shouldn't be able to do that, but people could. Then we're looking at rules and systems like Vassal Fix, because Vassals were being bugged right now. Script errors being fixed. Dark Fortress is unable to build walls. Yeah, I've actually noticed. I had noticed that beforehand. It was pretty rare though. But one thing that's missing here, because they mention dilemmas of character loyalty. But there's been some issues with character loyalty that I've had, like, say for instance, you get an army from an ally, and you're a faction that uses loyalty. You might have issues with that, and that is a bit of a problem. Like, let's say you're playing, Noctilus, you get an army from the High Elves, for instance, because yeah, you can ally them if you play your cards right. Or get an allied army, for instance, then the Lord there is going to have a loyalty issue. That might have been fixed in the past. I'm not entirely sure, though. AI's rules and logic. So on the campaign map, the AI is more willing to accept a peace treaty when it's far away from you, which is appropriate. Like, an AI across the map that doesn't have a chance to attack you and you're not going to attack them should accept a peace treaty. Fair enough. Better logic when it comes to building outposts. A fix to the Great Bastion. Suddenly it's actually useful because you can't just bypass it anymore. So factions can't just bypass it anymore or render the whole thing useless. This is going to affect Kolek, Village, Miao Ying in particular. Also Lokir Felhart to a degree, and Sinich to a degree, though not necessarily a significant one. But if the Bastion can't just be tunneled through, then that means that is the proper front line that it should have been from the very start. And to be quite honest, it never was. So right now, the Bastion might actually serve its intended purpose of holding back the chaos. It's taken them, what, almost a year to actually fix it. But they finally have done it. Apparently. We'll see if it's actually working. In terms of race balance, so what they've done with crumbling damage, they want undead to actually spend a decent amount of time in a crumbling state, as opposed to just collapsing instantly. And they made changes with 2.2. They weren't enough. Now they're toning down leadership. The reason it wasn't enough is because individual units for some of these factions, not necessarily all of them, but when we're thinking about the vampire counts, for instance, but not just that, it was fairly easy to get to a high level of leadership where your army would only really crumble by the point you had already lost the battle. And also especially for the AI, because it literally meant you're getting, that huge amount of damage as opposed to just the slow death of crumbling that Creative Assembly themselves says they want these undead factions to work as. So that's some changes. Bretonia changes. It's like infantry to costly, cavalry to weak. So what have they done with cavalry? Well, with units, they gave foot squires a free bonus versus infantry. Okay, that's good. Grail recruitment cost of 200 and an increase in speed. Okay, decent enough, I suppose. But when we're looking at the men-at-arms, cost reduction of 25 and spearmen arms of 25, it's like Bretonia doesn't have an economic issue on the campaign at all. In fact, you're going to be swimming in cash because you won't want, like, you could afford more knights, but you won't want to because you can end up in a lot of campaigns. If there's a tip I would give to people in campaigns, don't recruit units just because you have the money in the moment. Recruit them thinking, okay, can I afford this army and have some money extra, right, for the sake of diplomacy, sake of building more units down the line, sake of buildings themselves. Do I have that? And for Bretonia, there are some significant limiting factors. With peasants, you don't want to recruit too many of them because of the peasant economy. So a recruitment cost reduction is not really going to matter all that much. If it was a knight cost reduction, that would be a different discussion. But peasants are just too pathetic. I mean, you can buff them up, but again, the cost reduction is not really going to matter, I feel, for the sake of single player. Multiplayer, different discussion, of course. Okay, Dark Elves. I think that Dark Elves have actually gotten some of the most substantial changes because with the slave mechanic update. So they've decreased the slave decline rate on income and port building so that it scales linearly, increases the base slave cap by 500. This is great because when you are playing Dark Elf, and I've played several Dark Elf in a campaign, it could feel like you instantly have to increase that slave cap because it's just not enough. Hellebrand gets an additional base slave cap. Upgrade free technology now decreases slave consumption by 25%. And now you can also gain slaves through raiding in proportion to the income of the raided region and the strength of the raiding army. All right, that's great. That's all well and good because it was possible in a campaign, and this was the only real major issue. These were the two major issues. Slaves were good and have been good since the start of Warhammer 3. I mean, they're less powerful than Warhammer 2, but the system works. It does give you some potential bonuses. But the problem is, you start with too small of a slave cap. And two, it's very easy to spend a lot of slaves every single turn. Like in a Malekith campaign that I've been playing, I've reached a point that I'm spending over 1,000 slaves each turn. And while I can recover that, I can gain quite a few slaves through certain battles in a turn. Maybe there are certain turns where battles don't happen, so I end up with 0 slaves. And if you end up in that situation of having 0 slaves, your economy grinds to a halt. Your control is lesser. You get a bunch of issues in your empire. The Dark Elves are heavily reliant on slaves, so without that, they're screwed. So these changes, the increased base slave cap, that's significant early on in a campaign because the rights cost quite a few slaves. And so you won't just end up spending all of your slaves to use the rights and as well as other things. So that is pretty useful. reduction with certain buildings. I mean, your base economic building at tier 3 was spending a significant amount of slaves each turn, so decreasing that slave decline rate is a pretty big deal. Dwarves, basically, it's like they fixed one of Belegar's heroes, the engineer, right? Starting with skill that limits his skill tree, if I'm not mistaken. Could be wrong. But they fixed one of his heroes, locking out the other part of his skill tree, so he had less customization. But it's like, of all the issues the dwarves have, this is one of the least important. Now, granted, they did fix the grudges beforehand, but the dwarves still need a lot of fixes, I feel. I've played dwarven campaigns, I say that without a doubt. Now, Grand Cafe, they reverted the change from 2.2, where you can change yin and yang buildings between each other. This was horrible because it made playing campaign a lot worse than it was before. The reason it was so bad, is lets you confederate another cafe faction, or you're taking a settlement and suddenly your yin and yang is out of balance. Well, one of the ways you would obviously deal with that is converting buildings. But you no longer could do that. It made things worse. Now, I feel that with yin and yang, Cafe is generally a good race, but I feel to make yin and yang less frustrating, one of the things they should do is you shouldn't instantly go from balanced to imbalanced just because you have -1 or +1 with yin or yang. I think that you should get some space when it comes down minus maybe a 1, maybe a 3. Like if you go beyond 3, that's when things get imbalanced. Maybe just 1, like even just 1, just a buffer zone of 1 would be such a huge quality of life change to Cafe. From my perspective. Formation intact, melee defense 9 to 5. Greenskins have gotten a bunch of fixes, okay. The biggest Wa, wouldn't unlock all technologies, okay. So Grom has a starting enemy Aquitaine instead of Paravon, and meaning he no longer shares starting enemy with Orion, which could give you some interesting diplomatic options. And honestly, this is a huge quality of life change to Grom in a lot of ways, because while you might have gotten slightly better relations with Orion, the problem with this, like you could cook multiple times in the same turn. Yeah, being able to cook multiple times in the same turn was pretty exploitative, I'm not gonna lie. One of the reasons I've said Grom is one of the most powerful legendary lords is he could literally print money, and he could do it again and again and again and again. So he no longer can do that, but he's still really powerful. Having Aquitaine as an enemy instead of Paravon, well, here's the change in that. And I would probably need to test this for a full opinion, but I think what this is going to lead to is less scenarios where you end up very quickly in a war with the entirety of Athaloran, which is one of the problems that he has, and instead you're going to be in a safer position. On top of that situation, it's also going to be easier to reach Ulfon, because you're going to head west as opposed to east at the beginning of your campaign. So pretty significant changes there. Savage Orc Boar Boys, okay, a bit of a benefit in terms of upkeep. High Elves, some fixes. Terran Sunfang quest battle is fixed. It was a problem. Some benefits to military advancement, trade advancement, and cultural advancement. Yeah, because you were spending money to get that, but now you get some small bonuses. Curious to see what those are. And just multiplayer Dragon Counter UI works a multiplayer campaign as well. Khorne, he just basically gets a recruitment cost benefit to cast Knights of Khorne. Kislev, poor Kislev. So many issues Kislev has. And here's what they did. They fixed some graphical issues, basically. They fixed an issue where Boris wasn't getting his armor, which personally I haven't had, but alright. Festus has been added as a long campaign victory condition. Alright, fair enough, because you almost always are going to deal with that. But it's like, okay, you fixed some issues. Have you improved anything of all the other issues? The economic issues, the army roster issues, all that? No. I guess we're gonna wait until next year to get a proper fix to Kislev, and maybe even then not instantly. Some minor changes again and again. Bug fixes, great unclean ones have been buffed, and that's good because they were pretty weak. Ogre Kingdoms, long campaign victory conditions, correctly describing them. Vassals and allies, so it's gonna be easier to reach it, but a bunch of fixes. Poison Wind Globadiers have been increased in cost. Yeah, they're certainly capable of punching above their weight. Doomflayers decrease. All right. Dwarfing Menix decrease. All that. Some benefits, some fixes, with Skaven nothing too significant. Slaanesh, okay. Hellstriders going up in cost in multiplayer, but not single player. Empire, okay. So a bunch of fixes, all well and good, but here's the significant change. What lies below? So the Empire Elector count events would no longer work. They would just stop working in a campaign. That's fixed. Major quality of life change. You can play the Empire now as Gelt or Franz without that issue. The Empire still has a lot of problems, but at least their campaign is now playable. It wasn't thanks to 2.2. Maybe even before that. And slight cost reductions for quite a few melee units over there. The thing is, the problem with the Empire isn't the cost of units, though. Yeah, you should be able to spam a lot of spearmen and spearmen with shields and swordsmen now, more so than you were before. But the problem isn't the cost, is that the Empire just doesn't have powerful units. I mean, you can get a lot of them, sure. Like you can get more melee units as say Kislev can or Cafe, but you just don't have the strength until you get into greatswords, and therein lies the problem, because those spearmen, the swordsmen, they're just too weak right now. I would pay a higher cost if they were better in battle, personally. He gets tenacity, Tomb Kings. He now targets Volkmar instead of Khalida. Yeah, it was a bit silly that he targeted Khalida, I'll be honest. But I think one of the things that they need is a way to get the Books of Nagash easier from another faction that holds a settlement. Leadership reduction across the board by 5 or 10. Realms of Soul healing reduced by from 0.4 to 0.2. Tzeentch, yeah, just some minor changes, a bunch of leadership changes, bug fixes. One big change to Vampire Coast, and is that they had a limited raised dead pool, but now that has been increased, and that's certainly going to significantly benefit their campaigns. But they still have plenty of issues with their units. Really, what's missing in this patch is a fix to gunpowder units in particular, which really would affect the Vampire Coast, but they do at least get the ability to overwhelm their enemies with raw numbers, but they're still going to have a lot of issues. The problem with the Vampire Coast that they have is they have a lot of units with low armor, and what that means is they do poorly in auto-resolve, even in battles that they absolutely decimate the enemy in. And gunpowder units in battles don't work properly because of all the issues gunpowder units and range units overall have, but gunpowder units are certainly the worst. And on top of that, because of that low armor, they actually end up taking ridiculous amounts of damage very quickly, especially in auto-resolve. Like, with the Vampire Coast, you could win a battle with little to no casualties if you played it, but if you auto-resolve it, you're taking substantially more damage than the vast majority of other factions. You're pretty similar to a Skaven in that respect. And at least Skaven have units that can move past that. You don't really have that, unless you were talking Depth Guard and some high-tier units, and even then. So some fixes over here. Leadership changes as with other factions, okay. Be'lakor getting some fixes overall with that. A bunch of fixes overall. And we then get on to AI changes. So the AI is still gonna dodge spells, artillery projectiles, but then, oh, you don't have to deal with that on lower difficulties. No, it's still bad. I'll be blunt about it. It's just because the majority of the player base can avoid it, because the vast majority of the player base doesn't play on very hard, does not mean it's good. Also, it's an exploitable behavior in that while it's frustrating as all hell trying to land the mortar hit on the AI, because they have incredible dodging skills, the bigger problem when it comes to it is this particular behavior actually has just as many downsides for the AI as it does for the player. Because I've been in a lot of battles, in settlements in particular, because this is targeting settlements. I've been in a lot of battles where what will happen in settlements is the AI gets stuck in this motion of going back and forth. Like, they don't attack your units. They're not running all the way back because they've got conflicting orders. And I just feel like that should be fixed. The problem with that is you can have your entire range army literally slaughtering them, and they're not going to do a thing against them. They're just going to run back and forth because of this behavior. Instead of changing this behavior, it's like, oh, we are removing it on lower difficulties. And even then, only for spells, unless you're playing on easy. I assume most people play on normal. I believe so, at least. So I don't think, this is the problem I have with Creative Assembly. Sometimes it's like, oh, it's fine if Legendary is a piece of shit because you can't move your camera around the map. Not that moving the camera has any impact on your actual battle decisions or anything like that. Not that the limitations of quote-unquote battle realism matter in any fucking way. But it's like, okay, that doesn't matter because it's like, oh, it's Legendary, right? If you're playing Legendary, you accept that. No, how about you think about these kind of things better instead of just throwing it. It's like, oh, it's fine if it's on a higher difficulty. Let's just remove it for a lower difficulty. Well, okay, but it basically means people are playing different versions of the game. Already there were significant differences between playing a battle on very hard and normal, but now it's basically we're playing against different versions of the AI, which I think is taking things a bit too far. And the thing is, it's not fixing the fundamental issue. And in some ways, believe it or not, in some significant ways, you might find it harder in some ways to fight against an enemy on normal than it is on very hard. Because if the AI is not constantly stuck in that motion of back and forth, then the AI actually might be more useful in siege battles. They haven't fixed the behavior. Now, they say, oh, it's like if it has more critical stats, but the problem is at the moment is that the AI just can't decide what it's going to do between those tasks. So, yeah, I don't think doing it like this, where the AI acts differently dependent on difficulty, at least in battle, is a solution in any way, shape, or form. It's not. It's a band-aid. And it's just like, oh, we're going to improve it for the vast majority of difficulties. But it's like, it's not really a fix. And I do dislike it when quote unquote a fix is like, oh, let's fix it or remove something for a lower difficulty. And let's have really annoying crap for a higher difficulty. Because it is annoying. And I don't think that's a good way of designing difficulty personally. A bunch of fixes and also looking forward, okay. But we'll see what ends up happening in 2023. And that's all there is to say. Costin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, enable notifications, and I'll see you boys and girls next time.